John Miller sat comfortably in his private jet, staring out of the window at the endless blue sky. Life was good. As a successful businessman in New York, John was used to fast-paced days and long meetings. But today was different. He was heading to a tropical island for a company retreat, a much-needed break from his busy routine. The plane hummed steadily through the air. John glanced at his phone one last time before putting it away. There was no signal out here, just miles and miles of ocean beneath them. He leaned back in his seat, closed his eyes, and smiled to himself. Just a few more hours, he thought, picturing the warm sand and palm trees waiting for him. Suddenly the plane lurched. John's eyes flew open. A deep rumble echoed through the cabin and the seatbelt sign flashed on. The once smooth ride had become rough, with the plane shaking as if it were being tossed around by an invisible hand. "What's going on?" John muttered, gripping the armrest tightly. The captain's voice came over the speaker, calm but serious. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've encountered a severe storm. Please fasten your seatbelts and remain seated." John's heart raced as he peered out the window again. Dark clouds had swallowed the sky and lightning flickered in the distance. Rain began to pound against the windows, and the plane rocked harder with each passing second. The storm was fierce, and the wind howled like a wild beast. The once peaceful ocean below now looked angry, waves crashing against each other violently. The plane dipped suddenly, and John felt his stomach drop. Panic set in. The flight attendants rushed down the aisle, securing anything that wasn't bolted down. John tried to calm himself, breathing deeply, but the fear in his chest only grew. Then it happened. The plane shuddered violently, and a loud bang erupted from the back. The entire jet tilted to the side as the engines failed. John heard someone scream, but it was drowned out by the deafening roar of the wind. Everything became a blur as the plane spiraled downward. "Brace for impact!" the captain yelled. John grabbed the seat in front of him, his knuckles turning white. His mind raced with thoughts of his family, his job, everything he had left behind. The sound of the crashing waves grew louder, and in one terrifying moment, the plane hit the water. The impact was brutal. John's body slammed against the seatbelt, knocking the air out of him. Water began flooding into the cabin as the plane broke apart. Struggling to unbuckle his seatbelt, John felt the cold ocean surge around his legs. He had to move fast. With a burst of adrenaline, John freed himself from the seat and fought his way through the rising water. The cabin was filling quickly, and debris floated all around him. His lungs burned as he struggled to stay above the surface. Finally, he found an opening and pushed himself out of the sinking plane. The storm still raged overhead, but John could barely think about it. He kicked his legs as hard as he could, trying to swim away from the wreckage. Huge waves tossed him around like a rag doll, but he clung to a piece of floating debris, holding on for dear life. Hours seemed to pass as John drifted in the storm. Exhausted, he closed his eyes, praying for some kind of miracle. He didn't know how long he could survive in these conditions. Then everything went black. When John woke up, the storm had passed. The sun was shining brightly, and the air was calm. He felt the warm sand beneath him and opened his eyes slowly. He was lying on a beach, waves gently lapping at his feet. Somehow he had survived. John sat up, groaning in pain. His clothes were soaked and his body ached all over. As he looked around, he realized where he was, or rather, where he wasn't. There were no buildings, no people, no signs of civilization. Just miles of untouched beach, dense jungle, and the endless ocean stretching out before him. He was on a remote island, far from anyone who could help. John's heart sank as the reality of his situation hit him. He was alone, stranded in the middle of nowhere. But even as fear gripped him, a small part of his mind whispered, "You survived. Now you have to figure out what comes next." He took a deep breath, stood up, and began to explore the island. John's eyes fluttered open again, the harsh sunlight beating down on his face. His body ached all over and the taste of salt clung to his lips. For a moment, he wondered if the events of the previous day had been a nightmare. But as he sat up and looked around, the empty beach confirmed it was all too real. The wreckage of the plane was nowhere in sight, just him and the endless horizon of the island. A wave of panic surged through him. He was alone. The silence was unsettling. No hum of engines, no voices, nothing but the sound of the ocean lapping at the shore and the occasional rustle of leaves from the trees behind him. He scanned the beach, hoping against hope to spot someone, anyone, but there was no one, just sand, rocks, and thick jungle. John stood up, wincing as pain shot through his legs. His clothes were still damp and heavy, clinging to his skin. He felt a pit in his stomach. Whether from hunger or fear, he wasn't sure. But one thing was clear. He needed to survive. The sun was high in the sky, and the heat was already becoming unbearable. The first thing John needed was water. He stumbled forward, moving away from the beach and toward the jungle. The air was thick and humid, and every step felt like a struggle. As he walked, his eyes scanned the ground, searching for any signs of fresh water. He had no map, no compass, nothing but his instincts to guide him. After what felt like hours of trudging through the dense foliage, he heard it, a soft trickling sound. John's heart leapt, and he quickened his pace, pushing aside branches and leaves until he found a small stream flowing through the forest. He fell to his knees, cupping his hands in the water and drinking greedily. The cool liquid soothed his dry throat and washed away some of the fear that had settled deep inside him. For a moment, he allowed himself to feel a small sense of relief. But survival wasn't just about finding water. He needed shelter, and he needed food. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows over the island. He didn't know what kind of animals might come out at night, and the thought of being exposed in the open sent a chill down his spine. John wandered back toward the beach, his mind racing with ideas. His eyes landed on a cluster of palm trees, and he immediately set to work. He gathered large branches, palm leaves, and driftwood that had washed ashore. It wasn't much, but by the time the sun dipped below the horizon, John had managed to build a small shelter, just enough to keep him dry if it rained and to offer some protection from the wind. The night crept in slowly, and with it came an overwhelming sense of loneliness. As John sat under his makeshift shelter, staring out at the dark ocean, he felt more isolated than he ever had in his life. In New York, he was always surrounded by people, friends, colleagues, the constant buzz of the city. But here, there was nothing. No voices, no lights, just darkness and the sound of the waves crashing against the shore. The days that followed blurred together. John explored the island, hoping to find food or signs of life. But the more he wandered, the more hopeless it seemed. The island was larger than he had expected, with thick jungle that stretched as far as the eye could see. But there were no buildings, no people, just him. He found some coconuts scattered beneath palm trees, their hard shells proving a challenge to crack open. But once he did, the sweet coconut water and flesh were enough to keep him going. Each day he gathered what little food he could find, rationing it out to make sure he didn't run out too soon. But as the days turned into weeks, the isolation began to wear on him. The loneliness was a constant gnawing presence in the back of his mind. He would wake up each morning, hoping that somehow someone had found him, that a ship would appear on the horizon or that a plane would fly overhead. But each day the horizon remained empty. John started talking to himself just to break the silence. Sometimes he would mutter as he worked on his shelter, adding more branches and leaves to make it sturdier. Other times he would shout into the jungle, as if hoping that the trees might answer him back. But they never did. Despite the loneliness, John's survival instincts grew sharper. He learned how to catch rainwater by digging a hole and lining it with leaves, allowing the water to pool. He built a small fire using dry sticks and rocks, the flickering flames offering him a brief sense of warmth and comfort as the nights grew colder. But no matter how much he tried to focus on survival, the crushing reality of his situation never left him. Each evening, as he sat by the fire or lay under his shelter, staring at the starry sky, the weight of his isolation pressed down on him. He was truly alone, and he didn't know how long he could last. John sat on the beach, his feet buried in the sand, as he stared out at the vast, empty ocean. The sun was high in the sky, but its warmth no longer brought him comfort. Days had turned into weeks, and the weight of loneliness pressed on him like an invisible force. He had never been this alone before. The island had given him the basics to survive: food, water, shelter, but it couldn't provide what he needed most: someone to talk to. Every day the silence seemed to grow louder, the absence of human connection gnawing at his sanity. One morning, as John walked along the beach collecting driftwood for his fire, something caught his eye. Half buried in the sand, a weathered soccer ball lay, its once bright surface now faded and worn. John bent down to pick it up, feeling the rough texture beneath his fingers. It was just a ball, but in that moment, it felt like something more. He carried it back to his shelter, the ball tucked under his arm like a prize. Sitting on the sand, he studied it, turning it over in his hands. An idea sparked in his mind. Grabbing a piece of charcoal from the fire, John carefully drew two eyes and a simple smile on the ball's surface. He stared at his creation, the face staring back at him. "Buddy," John whispered, "your name is Buddy." For the first time in weeks, John felt a flicker of something, a connection, however small. It was silly, he knew that, but there was comfort in the absurdity of it. Holding Buddy up in front of him, he smiled, the ball's face grinning back at him like an old friend. At first, John only talked to Buddy as a joke, making small comments here and there as he worked on his daily tasks. "What do you think, Buddy? Should we try to catch some fish today?" he'd ask, as if the ball might respond. Of course it didn't, but just hearing his own voice again, even in conversation with a ball, made the crushing silence feel less suffocating. As the days went by, Buddy became more than just a ball. He was a companion, someone John could share his thoughts with. John would sit by the fire at night, talking to Buddy about his life before the crash, his job, his family, his hopes and dreams. It felt strange at first, but over time, the conversations became a part of his routine. John would tell Buddy stories from his childhood, moments he hadn't thought about in years. He told Buddy about his father, how they used to fish together in the summers. He talked about his first big business deal, the thrill of closing it, and the celebration that followed. He even shared his regrets, the long hours at the office, the time spent away from his family. At times, it almost felt like Buddy was listening, even though John knew that was impossible. But it didn't matter. Buddy was there, and that was enough. Weeks passed, and John's bond with Buddy grew stronger. He brought Buddy with him everywhere. On his daily walks through the jungle, to the stream where he collected water, even when he went fishing by the shore. Buddy sat beside him as he cooked meals over the fire, and at night John would place him carefully under the shelter, making sure he was safe from the wind and rain. "Good night, Buddy," John would say, placing his hand on the ball's weathered surface. "See you in the morning." Talking to Buddy eased the loneliness, and John found a strange kind of peace in their friendship. It was as if the ball had become a lifeline, a symbol of hope that kept him going. His imagination filled the gaps that reality left empty, and Buddy became a voice of reason when John's thoughts drifted too far into despair. One day, after a long trek through the jungle in search of food, John sat down on a rock, Buddy resting in his lap. He wiped the sweat from his brow and looked out at the ocean. "You know, Buddy," he said, a hint of a smile on his face, "I don't think I could have made it this far without you." The ball, of course, said nothing, but John felt its silent presence like a comforting hand on his shoulder. He chuckled to himself. "I'm going crazy, aren't I? Talking to a soccer ball like it's my best friend." But deep down, John knew that Buddy wasn't just a ball anymore. He was a companion in the truest sense of the word. Buddy had helped him through the darkest moments, kept him grounded when the isolation threatened to pull him under. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the sky in hues of orange and pink, John picked up Buddy and cradled him in his arms. "We'll get through this," he whispered. "We'll survive. Together." And for the first time in a long while, John believed it. The days had stretched into months, and John Miller felt the weight of time pressing down on him. His once sharp hope of being rescued had dulled into a quiet acceptance of his fate. The island, which had initially seemed so hostile, had become his strange sanctuary. He had learned to survive, but the loneliness gnawed at him like a constant ache. John sat by his fire one evening, watching the flames dance as the sky darkened. Buddy, as always, was beside him. He gazed at the horizon, the same endless stretch of ocean that had mocked him for months. No planes, no ships, no signs of life, just the steady crash of waves and the wind whispering through the palm trees. "How much longer can we keep doing this, Buddy?" John murmured, his voice hoarse from weeks of speaking only to himself and his companion. "It feels like no one's ever coming." The thought of giving up crossed his mind more and more these days. He had done everything he could, built shelter, found food, kept himself alive, But what was the point if there was no one to rescue him? His body had grown lean and tough from the months of survival, but his spirit felt brittle, ready to snap under the weight of hopelessness. He sighed deeply, glancing at Buddy, whose faded face seemed to watch him with silent concern. Maybe tomorrow we'll stop trying so hard. Maybe we'll just rest. That night, John lay awake, staring up at the stars. The fire beside him had died down to glowing embers, and the cool night breeze ruffled his hair. His mind wandered, drifting between memories of his old life and the reality of his isolation. But just as he was about to let sleep take him, something caught his eye. A flash of light far out on the ocean, barely visible but unmistakable. His heart jolted in his chest. "No, it can't be," he whispered, sitting up quickly. He rubbed his eyes and squinted into the darkness, hoping he wasn't imagining things. There it was again, a small glimmer of light moving slowly across the horizon. A ship. John's heart raced. He leapt to his feet, his exhaustion forgotten, adrenaline surging through his veins. "Buddy, a ship! Do you see it?" He grabbed Buddy and held him up, pointing toward the distant light. "We're going to be saved." Without wasting another second, John sprinted toward the fire pit. He had to signal the ship, let them know he was here. The fire had almost died out, but there was still time. He frantically gathered more wood, tossing it onto the embers, and began to fan the flames. Sparks shot into the air, and the fire roared back to life. John grabbed the largest branches he could find, adding them to the fire to make it bigger, brighter. His hands trembled with excitement, and he could feel his pulse pounding in his ears. The smoke began to rise, thick and dark, curling into the sky. Come on," he muttered, pacing back and forth. "You have to see it. Please, see it." He stared out at the ship, willing it to turn toward the island. His eyes were glued to the horizon, fear gnawing at him that it might pass by without noticing his signal. The minutes ticked by, each one feeling like an eternity. John's breath was shallow, his mind racing with thoughts of both hope and fear. But then, something changed. The ship turned. John's heart soared. He could see it now, moving slowly but surely in his direction. His hands flew to his head, disbelief washing over him. After all this time, someone had finally seen him. He dropped to his knees in front of the fire, his body shaking with relief. "We did it, buddy," he whispered, tears welling up in his eyes. "We're going home." The ship grew larger as it approached, and John scrambled to keep the fire burning high, feeding it more branches and dried leaves. The smoke billowed into the sky, a beacon of hope against the endless blue. As the ship neared the shore, John could make out its details. An old fishing boat, not huge, but large enough to carry a crew. He waved his arms wildly, shouting at the top of his lungs, "Here! Over here!" For the first time in months, his voice felt like it mattered. Someone could hear him. The boat finally came to a stop just offshore. Several figures moved on the deck, and one of them shouted back to him in English, "Hey, we see you. Are you alone?" John nodded furiously, his throat too tight with emotion to speak. He collapsed to the ground, overwhelmed with the realization that this nightmare was almost over. A small dinghy was lowered into the water, and two men rowed toward the beach. As they got closer, John could see their faces, rough, weathered by the sea, but filled with kindness and curiosity. "We've been looking for you," one of them said as they stepped out of the boat and onto the sand. "You're the man from the crash, right?" John nodded again, barely able to process the words. Yes, that's me." "You're lucky we came this way," the man said, glancing at the fire. "That smoke saved your life." John looked back at his makeshift camp, at the fire that had burned so many nights without purpose. Today it had become his lifeline. "Thank you," John whispered, his voice barely audible. "Thank you." The men helped him into the dinghy, and as they rowed back to the ship, John clutched Buddy tightly in his arms. The ship loomed ahead, and with it the promise of rescue, of home, of life returning to some kind of normalcy. But as he looked back at the island, now growing smaller in the distance, John felt something unexpected. It wasn't just relief that filled his heart. It was gratitude. The island had tested him, broken him down, but it had also taught him something he couldn't explain. The value of hope, the strength to persist, and the strange comfort of finding companionship in the loneliest of places. He smiled, looking down at Buddy, whose face seemed to reflect his own tired joy. "We made it," he whispered. "We never gave up." And with that, the island disappeared from view, and John was carried toward the future he had almost given up on. John stood on the deck of the ship, watching the coastline grow larger with each passing hour. The city skyline stretched across the horizon, a familiar sight that had once felt like home. But now, after months of isolation on the island, everything looked different, sharper, louder, and somehow distant. Civilization was just a few miles away, yet John couldn't shake the feeling that he was no longer the same man who had left it behind. As the boat pulled into the harbor, John felt his heart race. People bustled along the docks, cars honked in the distance, and the air was thick with the smells of the city, gasoline, food, the sea. It was a stark contrast to the stillness of the island, where the only sounds had been the waves and the wind. Here, everything moved quickly, constantly shifting, as if life was trying to make up for the time John had lost. He gripped Buddy tightly, the soccer ball worn and faded from months of exposure. It had been his only companion in the darkest times, and even though he was returning to a world full of people, Buddy still gave him a sense of comfort. The men from the boat helped him onto the dock, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, John stepped onto solid ground. His legs wobbled, unsteady from months of living on soft sand and uneven jungle paths. A small crowd had gathered, reporters, onlookers, even some of his colleagues who had feared the worst after the crash. But John didn't feel the urge to speak, to explain his ordeal. Not yet. As they led him to a waiting car, John felt overwhelmed. The noise, the people, the constant motion, it was all too much. He leaned back in the seat as the car sped through the city streets, the towering buildings and flashing signs blurring past. Everything seemed so familiar, yet he felt like a stranger here. Once they reached his apartment, John stepped inside and took a deep breath. The cool air from the vents hit his face, and the quiet hum of modern life surrounded him. The apartment was exactly as he had left it, neat, organized, and filled with the things he had once thought were important. His sleek furniture, expensive gadgets, and designer clothes all felt foreign now, like relics from a life that no longer belonged to him. John wandered through the rooms, touching the walls as if to confirm they were real. He glanced at the framed photos on his shelves, pictures of himself at company parties, standing with colleagues, shaking hands with business partners. These images had once been symbols of his success, but now they felt hollow. He had spent so much time chasing wealth, status, and recognition, but the island had stripped all of that away. His thoughts drifted back to the island, the nights he had spent alone under the stars, the endless days of searching for food and water, the simple joy of finding comfort in the presence of Buddy. Life had been hard there, but it had also been clear, honest. Every day had been a fight to survive, but in that fight, John had discovered something deeper about himself. He had learned the value of solitude, the strength of persistence, and the importance of the little things, things he had taken for granted before. John sat down on the edge of his bed, Buddy resting beside him. He stared out the window at the city below, watching people rush through their lives, unaware of how fragile it all was. They moved with purpose, but John wondered if they had ever truly stopped to appreciate the simplicity of just being alive. A knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. It was his sister, Margaret, her eyes wide with relief when she saw him. She rushed forward and hugged him tightly, her voice trembling. "I thought we lost you," she whispered. "I'm so glad you're back." John hugged her back, but there was a quiet sadness in his heart. He had returned to the world, but part of him was still on the island, where life had been stripped down to its raw essentials. "I'm here," he said softly, pulling away and looking at her. "But I've changed." Margaret nodded, her eyes searching his face. "I can see that. You're different, John. What happened out there?" John paused, trying to find the words. How could he explain the isolation, the struggle, the loneliness that had shaped him in ways he was still trying to understand? "I learned to survive," he said slowly. "But it was more than that. I learned about myself, about what really matters." Margaret sat beside him, her hand resting on his shoulder. "You don't have to explain it all now. Just know that you're safe. "You're home." John smiled faintly, but the word home felt strange on his tongue. This place, with its comforts and conveniences, didn't feel like home anymore. The island, harsh and unforgiving as it had been, had become his true home in some ways. There he had faced himself, stripped of all distractions. Days passed, and John tried to adjust to his old life. He met with colleagues, caught up with friends, and returned to the routine of city life. But everything felt different now. He couldn't focus in meetings, couldn't find joy in the things that had once excited him. He spent hours staring out the window, thinking about the simplicity of life on the island, the sun, the sea, the rhythm of survival. One evening, as John sat by the window with Buddy in his lap, he realized something important. The island hadn't just been a test of survival. It had been a lesson in patience, in solitude, in finding peace within himself. And though he was back in the world of civilization, those lessons would stay with him forever. He glanced at Buddy, smiling softly. "We made it, didn't we?" he said, his voice quiet. Buddy, of course, said nothing, but John felt the comfort of his silent companion nonetheless. He knew now that life wasn't about the noise and chaos of the city or the constant pursuit of success. It was about the moments of stillness, the strength to endure, and the ability to find hope even in the darkest places. John stood up and opened the window, letting the cool evening breeze wash over him. As he breathed in the fresh air, he realized that he wasn't the same man who had boarded that plane all those months ago. He was someone new, someone who had faced the depths of solitude and come out the other side stronger, wiser, and at peace. And in that moment, John knew that wherever life took him next, he would carry the island and its lessons within him forever.